the Tudor's Dynasty podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm so pleased to welcome back to the show for the first time in a while, Leanda de Lisle. Welcome back, Leanda.
It's great to be back. Thanks for asking me.
Oh, you're one of my favorite guests because you hold such a wealth of knowledge in that head of yours. And I'm excited to talk about the topic that we're going to discuss today because this is one that I don't really talk about much because I feel like it's really outside my comfort zone. But we're going to talk about faith in the Tudors, aren't we?
Yes, we are, and it is a sort of it is a complex subject. I found it quite complicated myself when I was I had to obviously study the changes of faith in all the Tudor books I've done, but my book on the Tudor family, the whole dynasty, where there were so many religious changes in particular. Yeah, I had to burrow on down into it.
Well, I have an interesting little anecdote here for you because I was at a meeting yesterday, and in the spring, it's just a little sidebar here. In the spring, I coached track and field at my old middle school. And we had a meeting with all of the coaches, and two of the coaches who are just joining this year are rather young, and they both attend some type of ministry school. And they were asking me about my podcast. And the first thing that the young man said, I believe he was 20 years old. So I just want everybody to understand how far the Tudors reach. I said to him, I talk about the Tudors and Henry VIII. And he goes, oh, I know about him and how he started a new church. And
Yes.
I had this moment where I was like, here's this young kid in the US who knows about this. And it just kind of blew my mind. I was very proud.
Well, it is an important subject. I remember hearing from some professors at Cambridge University, and they were professors of history, and they said how difficult it is with their young students when they're coming up to Cambridge, if they haven't had any religious education at all, specifically in the various Christian denominations, because it's so difficult to understand European history without any knowledge of it at all. And of course, increasingly people do arrive at university and haven't been brought up with a religious education of any sort or kind. It's then a struggle for them to really understand what's happening, because it shaped our world. It shaped the world we live in today very much.
Yeah,
To much greater extent than people realize, I think.
Yeah. Well, let's start there, shall we? I mean, I think a lot of the people listening to the show right now are probably familiar with the Great Matter, but let's talk about how this began. Under Henry VII, England was still a Catholic country under the Pope. Henry VIII comes along, and what happened to cause this?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that Henry VIII was a very devout Catholic. He went to Mass 4 times a day. It wasn't unusual. He went to pray nearly every evening with his wife. He wrote a book against Martin Luther, the German monk who was the sort of father of the Reformation. And he wrote specifically a defense of the 7 sacraments, 4 of which Luther said had no value, one of which was marriage, as a matter of interest. So Henry defended the sacrament of marriage, which meant you couldn't divorce if marriage was a sacrament. And Henry was not a man inclined to change his mind. And indeed, on this subject, your listeners may be surprised to learn he never did change his mind, and he never divorced exactly. He had his marriages annulled. That meant effectively that they had never existed in any real sense. And so what happened was, as your listeners will know, he was unable to have a son with Catherine of Aragon. She inconveniently would not die, and so he could marry again. So he was desperate to get an annulment of his marriage, and he wanted to annul it on the grounds that she had been married previously to his brother, who had died, and the then Pope had dispensed with an injunction against marrying your brother's wife. And Henry argued that you could not, the Pope had no right to dispense. And anyway, so for various reasons, the Pope didn't agree to this and was under pressure from Catherine of Aragon's nephew, the Emperor Charles V, who essentially had him by the balls, not to put too fine a point on it, because he had sacked Rome. And so Henry, I suppose the truth is, there's a Greek philosopher who said there's nothing easier to believe than that what is convenient for you to believe. So Henry came to be convinced that the Pope had stolen, not that particular Pope, but all popes, earlier popes, had stolen the rights of monarchs, such as himself, essentially to be Pope within their own kingdoms, and that he had the right to rule church and state, and that he was, in fact, an emperor. Because he had the right to rule church and state. So he broke with Rome to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and to marry Anne Boleyn. But then what? He did not become a Lutheran. As I mentioned earlier, he'd written a book against Luther, and Luther had said some very rude things about Henry. And Henry and Luther thoroughly disliked each other, and Henry would indeed burn Lutherans at the stake until the very end of his reign. But so his church, which he was, as I said, sort of pope of, did make changes. It got destroyed all the monasteries, got rid of all the monasteries. He took monastic land. That was one of the things he did. He translated the Bible into English. Now, actually, the Catholic churches in Europe and European countries had already translated the Bible into English, and there's a misunderstanding that this was an un-Catholic thing to do. It just hadn't been done in England because there had been a translation, an earlier translation that had been considered heretical. Anyway, so he translated the Bible into English, but he continued to hear the Mass, which is the central act of Catholic worship. And I hope this isn't going to bore your listeners, but if I sort of briefly explain the sort of core thing at the center of the Mass, because this is, if we want to discuss the Tudors and faith, you can see how things change when England becomes what we would now call a Protestant country. So in Catholic belief, at the moment of consecration, that is, so the Mass is essentially a sacrifice. And because it is a sacrifice, you have an altar and indeed a priest. And the priest transforms bread and wine into the literal body and blood of Christ. It essentially tears away the curtain of time. So there you are in church listening to the Mass, and it tears away the curtain. So you're there actually at the moment of Christ's crucifixion. And although the wine and the bread still look like wine and bread, they are transformed in every element into the body and blood of Christ. And Henry believed this until the day he died. And he managed, as you know, Anne Boleyn, poor Anne Boleyn, as we know, who he married, failed to give him a son, ended up with, head chopped off. And then he married Jane Seymour and did produce a son, who he was very anxious to protect. And one of the things he did is he said there would be no protector when he died, because his son was still a little boy of 9 when he was dying. He didn't want any one powerful figure. He remembered very well the fate of his uncles, his little uncles, the so-called princes in the Tower, who disappeared during the reign of Richard III, who may or may not have killed them. And so he wanted a whole sort of team of people to look after Edward. Anyway, literally the minute he was dead, of course, no one cared what Henry VIII thought anymore. He was dead. This is the great mistake of powerful people. They think they can, go on, people are going to go on doing their sets. No, that doesn't happen. Anyway, he died. And immediately, the new Edward, little Edward VI, aged 9, his uncle, his non-royal uncle, Edward Seymour, became protector, Duke of Somerset. And he was what we would now term a Protestant, and a Protestant of a particular brand. So he was not a Lutheran. he belonged to a more austere, I would say, form of Protestantism, which we might now call Calvinism after the theologian John Calvin. And so what does that mean? Because this is also important. So Luther, on the subject of the Eucharist, believed that although the elements of the bread and wine did not completely transform in every element, there was nevertheless a real presence. Christ was really present in the Eucharist. It's a very sort of complex, rather sort of subtle difference.
Yeah.
Real. Whereas the Calvinists, and which really became the basis of the Church of England, although the Church of England is, covers all sorts of grounds, but bear with me here, believed it was essentially just that the Eucharist service was really just done in commemoration of the Last Supper. And there was no transformation of bread and wine or anything like that. It's just, they wouldn't have an altar. They would have a communion table in the middle of the church, and you could sit around and you could drink the bread and the wine and all that. And it was just bread and wine. But you remembered. It was you, and there were more important elements. So it was what was much more important to these Protestants was sermons, listening to sermons. They didn't approve of religious art of any sort or kind. So as soon as Henry died, there was this, the first thing they did was destroy stained glass windows, took down statues, crucifixes, everything like that. Churches were sort of whitewashed. And then and they started bringing Edward, don't forget, it's only 9, up as a Protestant of this kind, and they, when they felt they were sufficiently powerful, they got rid of the Mass, which triggered a massive rebellion.
Expected,
which triggered a massive rebellion, which was crushed with the help of mercenary troops brought in from Germany and Italy. And the regime was really very unpopular. They melted down church bells. I mean, people really didn't like it much, to be honest. I mean, some people did, though. I mean, there were those who did like it, but they were a minority. But Edward was still a boy, and if he was king for a long time, then these changes would have progressed. But when he was only 15 years old, he fell dangerously, and as it would turn out, fatally ill. His heir, under the last act of settlement, was his half-sister Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who was a Catholic. Although what she was saying at this time was really that she wanted to go back to the sort of Henrician brand of Catholicism. And she'd been saying that it was illegal for the sort of protector and then after that John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who after poor old Somerset lost his head, we won't go into that. It was illegal for them to change the religion that Henry VIII had installed, Henry VIII's church, while Edward was still a minor. And she was, a tough cookie, Mary. People forget that her daughter, not only was she the mother of Catherine of Aragon, who was in charge of the war against Scotland in 1515 and the Battle of Flodden, where the King of Scots was killed, and she had offered to send his head to Henry, who was in France, and had to be dissuaded by the English commanders who said, she said, what did she write? She wrote to Wolsey saying their English hearts would not suffer it.
Right.
So she was a tough cookie, and her mother, who had been a reigning queen, had booted the Muslims out of Spain, and so she was no slacker either. Anyway, so this is the heritage Mary comes from, and her father was Henry VIII. He's not exactly Mr. Mr. Weaky either. They thought, as they said, she's only a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, her mother was only a woman. Her grandmother was only a woman. They slightly forgot, but anyway, she was only a woman. And so they thought, what we can do is we're going to leave the throne. Edward will leave the throne to his Protestant cousin, who's the same age as him, 15, turning 16, I think, at this time, actually. Maybe 16 at this time, actually, who had been brought up in the same way as a Protestant, and a Protestant of this particular kind. And Edward wanted to call Parliament that would endorse Jane as queen. He didn't like the idea of a woman ruler, so he had her married off to the Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland's son, the unlucky Guildford, who was about 17. Also, of course, excluding the other half-sister, Elizabeth, who was a Protestant. But Edward thought, well, I'm excluding Mary on the grounds that my father had the marriages to Mary and Elizabeth annulled, because he also had his marriage to Anne Boleyn annulled, and they were declared illegitimate in Parliament. So if I'm excluding Mary, which he did on grounds of her illegitimacy, then he had to exclude Elizabeth as well. And anyway, he said, her mother tried to murder my father, which is why he had her head chopped off. Anne had her head chopped off, so don't want her. So he left the throne to Lady Jane Grey, who was proclaimed queen in London. I think it was the 9th. I think he died on the 6th. It was the 9th, anyway. It was 2 or 3 days later.
Yeah.
In London. And people were none too thrilled about this. They were very shocked because they expected Mary to be queen. But even the imperial ambassadors, that is the ambassadors of her nephew, Charles V, said, yeah, well, it's a done deal. The Duke of Northumberland, i.e. Jane's father-in-law, he's in charge of all the armies and power in the land. And so, what chance does she stand? Nothing. We might as well just sort of cross our fingers and hope she doesn't get her head chopped off. But Mary was made of sterner stuff than the imperial ambassadors, raised an army, and ordinary people, and Elizabeth, this was something Elizabeth would never forget, ordinary people refused to serve their lordly masters, who largely supported Jane, because they'd all been forced to sign up to Edward's will. And the truth is, if you're a nobleman, you're very powerful. If you have your affinity, which is, all your, not only your relations, but your tenants, the people who work for you, the people connected to you, the sort of power connections. But if your affinity won't support you, you're just a random bloke with a fancy title. That's all you are. You're nothing. You can go around shouting and screaming and waving your big broadsword. But if you haven't got, an army behind you, you're pretty stuffed. And they realized this, and poor old Jane was reigning from the Tower for sort of 9 days, after which some of her leading supporters, the nobles, deserted her and went and proclaimed Mary queen, and Mary became queen.
Mm-hmm.
And then what does Mary do? Of course, she brings in Catholicism. And she does this at first. The first thing she does is she re-legalizes, because it had been made illegal under Edward, the Catholic Mass. Jane, who hears about this from prison, and who is a very ballsy teenager, and all those kind of sort of slightly soppy descriptions of her are nonsense. She was a very, very highly educated and very passionate teenager. I mean, think of what's that one called who goes around complaining about the environment and Palestine? What's she called? Greta Thunberg.
Yeah.
Exactly. Think Greta. So think Greta. Very passionate, very, quite, focused on what she believes.
Mm-hmm.
And she writes an open letter condemning the mass as a kind of form of satanic cannibalism, and those who attend it as having the stinking souls of Satan, and suggests that people rise against it in Christ's war, is what she says. And her father, meanwhile, who'd been pardoned for his original opposition to Mary, also opposes Mary's intended marriage to Philip of Spain and Charles's son, the Emperor Charles. So, did I say that Emperor? Yes, that's right. Yes, I was getting confused. I must get their relation, the genealogy, right? Anyway,
right.
Anyway, so there's a rebellion. They lose. The rebels lose. Just, and Mary has Jane executed. She's only 16 years old. She's very brave, and she really dies a kind of martyr. Elizabeth is also put under arrest, but she's not executed, not involved in the revolt. Now, of course, Mary has to produce a son if this is going to continue. And she believes she's pregnant at one point. Well, at 2 points, but this is at the first point. And she wants to protect the future of Catholic England. And one of the ways she's going to do this is by destroying the Protestant, or she would put it, heretical minority. Now, in France, and indeed in Germany, they tended to go in for sort of just going around massacring people left, right, and centre. In England, Mary was determined to use the law. And so she revived her father's old heresy laws. But of course, there were many more Protestants by now than there had been under her father, because there'd been numerous conversions and things under Edward, and there were many believing Protestants out there, still a minority, but still many of them. And well, the result was that over 300, men, women, and really children were burnt at the stake, which was horrific, obviously, and earned her the later sobriquet of Bloody Mary. And people sometimes say, oh, she was persuaded by the priests or by these. No. For better or worse, Mary made her own decisions, and that was Mary's decision. And the people's response varied. So in some places, people were appalled, horrified. In other areas, people sort of sold strawberries, and it was all considered, a bit of an outing to go and watch some poor person being burnt. And again, if she had survived, Catholicism, which after all Protestantism hadn't been around very long, I'm sure would have been destroyed, and England would have become again a Catholic country. But her first pregnancy was a false pregnancy, and then her second pregnancy, which she also thought she had, was also a false pregnancy. She was ill, and it transpired she was dying.
Yeah. And
in 1558, she did die. And the throne, under the Act of Settlement, passed to Elizabeth, who is a Protestant. But I'm not going on too much here, am I?
No, please. I'm enjoying this.
I'm slightly on a stream here.
Go.
Okay, well, just tell me if you need me to. Okay, so Elizabeth becomes queen. Now, Elizabeth is a Protestant, but she is a very naturally conservative figure. She's older than her brother Edward had been. Edward was only 9, don't forget, when he was taken in. Well, he wasn't taken in, he was king, but when he was surrounded by these Protestant figures who believed very passionately in this kind of Calvinist form of Protestantism. Elizabeth was that little bit older and was rather attached to the kind of elaborate services she remembered under Henry VIII, and had never really taken to Calvinism. Also, you have to remember that from her perspective, I mean, she wasn't going to be a Catholic in communion with Rome. They regarded her mother as a bastard. Interestingly, Mary Tudor, she became queen. There was a law that revoked her the statement of illegitimacy against her. That Elizabeth never dared do that, partly because under church, was very boring this, but anyway, now I've started, I better tell you. Under church law, very briefly, if you marry believing that it's a valid marriage and you have children, they are not illegitimate in church law and canon law. Okay, but if you marry knowing full well that your marriage is illicit, and Henry was well aware he had had an affair with Anne Boleyn's sister, then it stays. You know, your children are illegitimate. And because it was such a can of worms, Elizabeth never dared open that. And she actually stayed illegitimate in law all her reign.
I didn't realize that. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yes, no, so I tell you, she was an amazing woman because she was in a seriously tricky position in so many ways. You had all these male Protestant theologians who'd all come out with these treaties saying that women couldn't be reigning queens, that, you know, God was against the monstrous regiment, which means reign, the monstrous reign of women, and so forth. And, you know, even people like William Cecil, her closest sort of political ally, was arguing that she didn't really rule because she ruled through her, you know, the men around her, or Parliament, you know, which of course she didn't agree with. But anyway, so, you know, she was in a tricky position in many ways, which we'll come back to. Anyway, and she was perfectly well aware that she had been betrayed by the Protestant elite who had backed the reign of Queen Jane. But of course, they're the only people who were going to be backing her now, so she was sort of slightly stuck with them. But she didn't trust them. And as she said right at the beginning, she put her trust in the people who had supported Mary and now supported her, much more than she ever did the elite. So she now had a slight battle royal over the religious settlement, because people like William Cecil at that time, he would soften, change, and the other members of the Protestant elite who were supporting her were much more radical Protestants than she were. They were much more Calvinist than she was. And so she insisted on this kind of, not exactly halfway house, but it was a very one of her own bishops said it wasn't a golden mean, it was a leaden mediocrity. It was, i.e., it kept a lot of Catholic stuff. So it wasn't Catholic, but it had a lot of, well, it still had priests. She liked them to wear surplices, which were reminiscent of vestments which you wear for the mass and for a sacrifice. You don't wear if you're just giving a sermon. And indeed, when they started talking about Puritans, what caused the people to be called Puritans was that they objected very strongly to the wearing of surplices. Elizabeth liked surplices, but she liked to have order in her religious services. She didn't like people just standing up and giving random prayers. She particularly disliked sermons, being sort of lectured by some, you know, minister. She didn't care for any of those things. And I think at the time people assumed, okay, so we've got this kind of mishmash, but of course we've got to bring in our very conservative, quite Catholic population, and we've got the Lutherans, and we've got the Calvinists, and we want everyone to be a bit happy. And they assumed that over time they were better to make it more, and the Puritans in particular assumed if they pushed in time, it would become more Protestant, you might say, or more Calvinist. But Elizabeth, who chose as her motto "Semper Idem," I never change, didn't change. So she dug in her heels, and this had some interesting effects. So I suppose the first thing one has to realize is that, you know, Catholics' persecution did begin under Elizabeth, slowly at first. She got rid of all the old Catholic bishops, and there were changes again in the parishes. More iconoclasm, which she didn't really like. I mean, so she kept having sort of putting crosses in her chapel, and then her priests, well, her ministers, because they weren't priests, would sort of take them away and sort of throw them out as idolatrous, and then she'd sort of put them back, and she liked elaborate music. She employed, people like, Byrd and Tallis, who were considered, a bit Catholic-y, not very Calvinisty. But outside, she couldn't control things outside her own personal chapel. So elsewhere, a lot of stuff was destroyed. And people think a lot of stuff in England and the churches was destroyed much later under Oliver Cromwell. But actually, no, it was basically 90% of religious art was 90%, can you imagine, was destroyed during the 16th century under the Tudors. And one of the most fascinating things, I think, was that almost the vast majority of medieval music, pre-Reformation music, was destroyed. And because it wasn't printed, because it was in written manuscripts, there's no record of it. So we literally have hundreds of years of music, and we only a tiny, tiny amount has survived. So there could have been a kind of Mozart or a Bach, or I don't know, it could have been the equivalent to those geniuses. And we will never know, because they all went up in smoke, which is quite a thought, isn't it?
It is. It's sad.
It's sad, yes, it's sad. But anyway, it happened. And anyway, so persecution began, and then it became more extreme. Priests trained, Catholic priests, English Catholic priests trained in Europe, started coming back from the continent in the late 1570s, and then started being executed. Not under heresy laws, because it was quite difficult, because heresy was a different thing. So Elizabeth did actually burn heretics, but she burned very extreme Protestants. And there weren't that many of them, so there were only like 2 or 3 burnings, but people really don't know, but she did actually burn people for heresy, but just there weren't that many. But Catholics were executed for treason, but it was just treason to be a Catholic, so it doesn't really make much difference. It was just treason to be a. And there was a rebellion at one point in favour of Mary, Queen of Scots, as her heir, and that obviously which was crushed, and that would obviously make things worse for Catholics. Interestingly, though, before we get to Mary, Queen of Scots, I've missed something out. So I was saying, wasn't I, that she had this sort of problem with, she remembered all the Protestant elite who had supported Lady Jane Grey.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Lady Jane Grey had a sister. She had 2 sisters, actually. But anyway, there's one important one, Catherine. And Catherine, under the Act of Succession, which made her queen, was her heir, not Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots had been demoted under the last Act of Settlement by Henry VIII, because she was a foreigner, basically, and he couldn't control who she was going to marry. And so Lady Catherine Grey was Elizabeth's heir, and she was very much a Protestant. Her sister was this martyr, really this virtual martyr, Lady Jane Grey, who had died for her faith. And so Elizabeth was terrified that she would marry and have a son, because Elizabeth, for a number of reasons, couldn't marry and have a son. And so she was desperate that nobody would speak to this girl, and she was horrible to her and sort of demoted her so that hopefully no one would speak to her of anything to do with her. But unfortunately for Elizabeth, this young lady was sort of 18, I think, when Elizabeth became queen, fell in love with the Duke of Somerset's son, impeccable Protestant credentials, English nobleman, very suitable candidate to be a king consort. And they married in secret. And I had great fun writing about this romance because I found all the sort of documents describing their illicit relationship, which has amazing details in it. Like, I mean, literally, their wedding night describes which side of the bed they slept on, that she was still wearing her bonnet while they were in bed, how many times they had sex, and then you don't get those kind of details often in the 16th century, I can tell you.
No.
Anyway, they married secretly. Elizabeth found out. She was furious. She threw them into the Tower, where Catherine then proceeded to have a son, which was terrible, obviously, and Elizabeth couldn't do anything about that. But she had this child declared illegitimate because she said there were no proper witnesses to the wedding. But again, in canon law, to have a legitimate marriage, all you need to do is say you intend to be married in front of witnesses. And because of all these interviews I was telling you about, where they were saying, what happened? And they had said, yes, we're married, we want to be married, blah, blah, blah. So they had plenty of witnesses. And to Elizabeth's horror, because people in the Tower felt sorry for them, and of course the guards and things were all Protestant because Protestants had been put in charge, they sort of left the sort of cell doors unlocked. And so there was a terrible corridor creeping in the Tower. And Catherine and this boy, were at it like rabbits. And again, you have all the description, even of the sort of colour of the sort of bedding they were sleeping on. And the result was that she became pregnant again and had another son. Elizabeth, as you can imagine, had a fit.
Right. This is a threat to her.
A major threat. And so the couple are separated, and Catherine is put in a number of sort of country house prisons. Interestingly, one of the things I found out, which I just find quite fascinating, her last jailer was a man called Owen. And he was an illegitimate descendant of Owen Tudor, who was the grandfather of Henry VII. I mean, he was the founder of the dynasty, this obscure Welshman. Anyway, that's a sort of side thing. I just find it quite fascinating.
That is interesting.
And anyway, so Catherine separated from her husband, who she wrote all these letters saying, how much she'd enjoyed, rumpy pumpy with him, and how much she missed it and all the rest of it. Really quite passionate letters. Essentially dies of a broken heart, age 28. And this is in 1568. Okay, so this is all during the 1560s. We never hear about Catherine in English history. And the reason is, of course, it doesn't fit with English national myths, which is all about Elizabeth versus the Catholic rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. And it's sort of like brush over the fact that her heir was this Protestant girl who Elizabeth destroyed, and that Elizabeth wasn't the great goddess of English Protestant nationalism that she's been portrayed as. She destroyed her English Protestant heir before Mary became very powerful. 1568, Catherine dies, and Mary is forced to leave Scotland, comes to England, and is immediately jailed. And as I said, then there's this rebellion, the Northern Rebellion, 1569. And things become increasingly difficult for Catholics. And as priests start being executed in 1578, it becomes even more difficult in 1582 when the Pope excommunicates Elizabeth. And you get, a lot of executions of priests and people hiding priests and so forth. Meanwhile, I suppose, what is happening with the sort of faith angle? So Elizabeth, and I think people will be surprised, they have to remember that Elizabeth, although she was an incredibly powerful woman, an incredibly brave woman, resilient, remarkable queen, she really was, otherwise she would never have survived. But that does not mean she was in a strong position. She was always in a very vulnerable position because she was a woman, because she had no heir. And so she could not impose the church she wanted on England, it was just impossible. No one would have listened. It was too difficult for her to do, which is why she just did things in her own private chapel. And she wasn't really paying much attention to the Church of England. Well, not as much attention as she might have done. And so it was becoming quite, lots of people left the priesthood, and a lot of them weren't particularly educated. People stopped going to church. Well, actually, no, they had to go to church because otherwise they got fined. But, the whole thing, and people got very confused. They didn't really understand, hadn't really been taught much about their own religion. So they didn't understand that you couldn't have crucifixes on graves and all these other things. The people who did understand were the Puritans, and this is one of the reasons they became such a driving force, because they were interested and they were the best preachers and the most sort of alive part of the Church of England at that time. But by the end of her reign, which is an old lady in the 1590s, her influence has helped produce another movement. I suppose there are always going to be people who like to have churches with beautiful works of art in it, who like to have a bit of music. There are different tastes in a way. I mean, you can say that this is the right way, that's idolatry and that's not, or whatever, which is obviously a religious point. But actually, if you just look at human beings the way we are, some people are attracted to some ways of worship and some people are attracted to others. So some people like to sit and read the Bible and don't really want to go and don't enjoy ritual, whereas other people love bells, smells, and you need all that to get going. And so I think that's part of it as well. There were people to whom that appealed, and I found the sort of the Puritans a bit, slightly kind of. Some of them, the more Puritan ones were quite sort of dour. It's a mistake to think they all were, because they really, really weren't. That would be quite wrong to say. But there are sort of jokes about. There was a joke about the Puritans at the time. They said, a Puritan is a man who loves God, who loves God with all his heart and hates his neighbor with all his soul.
I like that.
Anyway, there was definitely a sort of division of opinion. And Elizabeth also had very strong views on married priests, for example. So because priests were technically ministers, and their vows as priests were sort of fairly meaningless, you could marry and you could do what you like. Although technically you can marry in the Catholic Church as well, but that's more complicated. But anyway, and so there were lots of married priests in England, but Elizabeth really disapproved of them, wouldn't have anything to do, made her mad with rage. She would occasionally lose her temper if she saw too many vicars' wives hanging about. She'd get into a terrible rage. And her sort of Archbishop of Canterbury and things, that was described as her little black husband because he wore black. She did not approve of married priests. Anyway, so when she died, she had him holding her hand, and it's worth remembering that I think sometimes she's painted as a secular figure. There were very few, almost no secular figures in this period. I mean, there were some, but very, very few. People live very close to death. And they say, don't they, there are no atheists in the trenches. They used to say that in the First World War anyway. When you're constantly living close to death, it tends to sort of make you more religious. And anyway, Elizabeth was certainly a religious and believing Christian, as they all were. Anyway, as you know, she died in 1603. And then her cousin, King James of Scots, Mary Queen of Scots, his son, who was a Protestant, raised very much as a Presbyterian, which is a sort of form of Calvinism, became king. And he was very interested in religion and very knowledgeable on theology. And he then reformed the Church of England which sort of badly needed it at that stage, as I said, because it had slightly been let go under Elizabeth, not because she wasn't interested, but because I think she wasn't in a particularly strong position to impose her own vision.
Sure. Yeah. One of the things that I want to go back to, because I think this is so important to realize, is that during the reign of Henry VIII, before the Church of England was created, everybody who lived during that time, or maybe not everybody, but a majority of the people were Catholic. And this is the life that they knew. Like you said, they were used to going to mass. They were used to these things. Henry VIII comes along and forms the Church of England. And now you have kids who are being born during this time, and that's all that they know. Edward VI, Jane Grey. How confusing it must have been for everyone.
It must have been. That's why I think there were a lot of people that there was a real decline for a long time. Certainly under Edward, and then under Elizabeth, there was a certain revival under Mary, and it got back better again under Elizabeth when people just lost interest in going to church in the way they did, because there's a whole way of life went with it, of course. So exactly. So before the Reformation, you had all these saints' days and holy days, and so I have sometimes I try and explain to people there are things that people are now repelled by, so non-Catholics are repelled by, that I have to explain to them why they're not repellent. And so, for example, I'll give you an example: relics. And a relic is a bit of, a saint. It could be their toe or their finger, or it could be a whole body, it could be whatever, a bit of them anyway. And these were actually particularly popular in England. The English loved relics. St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which is the main church in London, was hung with lots and lots of relics, which were all encased in beautiful sort of gold and silver works of art. And if you go to any museum in Europe, on the continent, you will see reliquaries, which are beautiful things. You can't sell a relic. You can't sell the bit of the saint, but you can sell the reliquary. So that's another thing. And so why were these so popular? People think, oh, that's gross. A bit of a finger or a bit of a toe, or you see, may have gold on it, but still a bit of skull. It's not necessarily something you'd want to have in your sitting room or whatever. But if you think of it like this, if there's someone you love or admire, often people want to go and visit their grave, don't they? Because it makes them feel close to them. Sometimes now people are cremated and they'll sort of keep their ashes, or they'll keep their ashes close to them. People now even, which I have to say, I do think it's quite bizarre, but people even now sort of, have granny sort of turned into a piece of jewelry, and they wear earrings, or I don't know what they do. But people do all these things.
Yeah, they do.
So if you think of that, this is what, so relics were a way of feeling close to a particular saint. And why did you want to be close to a particular saint? So God is a bit scary. He's a scary guy in a way, isn't he? Maybe he shouldn't be, but, God, you think God, he is God, and he can be nice to you, but he can also sort of crush you and do all sorts of terrible things. And he's perfect, and that's all a bit scary. So it's a bit less frightening to pray to, often a woman, for example, because the Trinity are all male. So it's quite nice maybe to pray to a woman, and a woman who has been through childbirth. Maybe she died in childbirth, or maybe something happened to do with childbirth, or maybe she saved a child. There'll be some connection, and you can pray to her and say, will you please help me when I have my baby? And then you've got her relic hanging in your church, or something of her, and it makes you feel closer to her, and you can focus on, so you're not worshipping, the toe, or indeed the statue of whoever this saint may be, but it's there for you to feel close to them and to inspire you. So this whole world was swept away. And one of the things that strikes me about the Reformation is that it got rid of all the women. No women I mean, Mary, Mother of God, was a huge, vast, and we still say in the Catholic Church, was a huge deal in medieval England. So England was known as Mary's dowry. That was the name we gave ourselves, that we were the dowry of Mary, the Virgin. And suddenly, no women. No women to pray to, no women to act as intercessors with, with God. And I think that must have been greatly felt. Because, of course, this was long before the time of now you have women priests and things like this, but you didn't have them. On the contrary, when Elizabeth became, because, of course, her father had been head of the Church of England, and because, Protestant theologians were saying, women shouldn't speak in church and women shouldn't do this and shouldn't do that, she became governor. They had to sort of change it. So the feminine was taken out, really. And one doesn't really read about the effects of that. I've often wondered how that went. I don't know if there's been a study of that, but it's something that I think about. I notice, I suppose, when I'm writing about this period.
Yeah, it's so interesting. This conversation today has been fascinating. I've just enjoyed listening to you. I always love when you come on the show. Like I said, you are just a wealth of knowledge and you provide so much for us to think about. And for anybody who's listening right now, if you've listened or watched the show today and you have some questions and maybe we didn't cover something or something popped into your head while Leanda was talking, and there's a question that you have, feel free to reach out. You can send me an email. You can reach out on social media. I'm happy to relay that information to Leanda as well. Or maybe we'll do another episode where you can answer those questions. How's that sound?
Yeah, sure. I'll be delighted.
Well, I've really enjoyed having you on the show today. You've been on several times before, like I've said. Why don't you take this opportunity right now to promote the books that you've written?
Oh, right. Thank you very much. Okay. So I've written a book on the whole dynasty called Tudor. In England, it's called Tudor, the Family Story, Britain. And in America, it's called Passion, Manipulation, and something else. I've slightly lost track, actually. And I hope you enjoy that one. It begins actually very early before the reign of Henry VII and covers the whole dynasty. I've done another book on the Grey sisters, Lady Jane Grey and her sisters. I haven't had a chance today to talk about the youngest, little Mary Grey, who's actually quite a fascinating character. And that's called The Sisters Who Would Be Queen. Mm-hmm. And there's another book on the accession of King James. Actually, a friend of mine has written a book called Queen James. Gareth Russell, very funny guy. But anyway, I love him dearly. But called God, I can't remember what it was called now. Anyway, on the death of Elizabeth and the accession of King James. And my two most recent books actually been on the Stuart period, which might interest you particularly because this year is the 400th anniversary of the accession of Charles I as King of England, and it's called White King. The Tragedy of Charles I. And I've done another one on his wife, Henrietta Maria, a biography of Henrietta Maria, who I absolutely loved. And people think she's awful and dreadful. And, so I hope that I will change your mind on her because she is a fantastic woman. And it's a great story. My agent was very against me writing it and said, because I'd written this book on Charles. And she said, oh, don't write a book on Henrietta Maria. People just think it's all the boring bits you left out. And I said, no, there are no boring bits in her life. You have no idea how gripping it is.
Yes.
I really enjoyed it. And so I hope you will too.
Yeah, your writing. I don't like to pick favorites, but I do have to say in this instant, you are my favorite writer. I just get so immersed in your writing. And even though it's nonfiction, it almost reads like fiction. It's so entertaining. You have such a gift. I can't tell you that enough.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, the book on Charles won a literary prize, actually, the Historical Writers Association Crown. I was very proud of that. I've got it somewhere.
I say well deserved.
Thank you very much.
Well, if you are interested in checking out Leanda's books, I know they're probably available on Amazon. Are they available anywhere else?
They are available on Amazon, and they should be available in all good bookstores. And you can always, because they haven't come out this year. If they're not, it's usually pretty easy to order them. You just ring up the bookshop and say, "Can you get it in for me?" They will. But Google it first. I do actually have a website which is slightly out of date. I've been very lazy, but you can look at them on my website, which is leanderdelisle.com. And I'm sorry, it's looking a bit. I think it's. I haven't sort of redone it recently, but it's got all the books listed there.
Perfect. Leanda, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.